The snow had been falling since dusk, a relentless curtain of white swallowing the narrow road to Dunmere. Inside the stone cottage at the edge of the village, Margaret Ellison sat by the crackling fire, mending a tear in her woolen shawl. Outside, the wind howled through the chimneys like a restless spirit. She had grown used to the quiet winters since her husband passed away 3 years ago, but that night, something in the air felt different, heavier, as if the world was holding its breath. A sudden knock shattered the stillness. Margaret froze, needle in hand. No one came to her door at that hour, especially in a storm like this. The knock came again, louder this time, desperate. She rose, her heart thudding, and opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, his coat covered in snow, his breath visible in the icy air. He was tall, with dark hair slicked back from the melting flakes, and eyes that seemed to gleam even in the dim lantern light. "I'm sorry to trouble you," he said softly. "My carriage broke down near the old bridge. I saw your light. May I come in for a while?" Margaret hesitated. No one ever traveled through Dunmere in winter unless they had a reason. But the cold was merciless, and she could not leave him out there to freeze. "Come in, quickly," she said. The man stepped inside, shaking the snow from his shoulders. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed, a historian traveling north to Edinburgh. His voice was calm, measured, but his eyes wandered around the cottage as if he recognized it. Margaret poured him a cup of tea, noticing how his gaze lingered on the portraits above the hearth, the same portraits that had belonged to her husband's ancestors. "You live here alone?" he asked after a moment. "Yes. Since my husband died," she replied. "This house has been in his family for generations." Thomas nodded slowly. "Ah. The Ellison house," he murmured. "I've read about it." Margaret frowned. "Read about it? Why would you?" He looked up, meeting her eyes with a faint, unreadable smile. "Old houses often have stories, Mrs. Ellison. Some more peculiar than others." The fire flickered violently, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying a sound that might have been a distant cry, or perhaps only the storm itself. Margaret shivered and turned towards the window. When she looked back, Thomas was still watching her, his expression unreadable. And then she noticed it, his boots were dry. Margaret could not sleep that night. The storm had grown fierce, battering the windows with gusts that sounded almost human in their sorrow. Thomas had taken the guest room at the end of the corridor, and though the house was old and accustomed to creaking, she kept hearing faint movements above, soft footsteps, a door closing, then silence. At last, she lit a candle and stepped into the corridor. The walls seemed to hum faintly with the wind. She called out, "Mr. Reed," but only the echo of her own voice returned. The light of her candle trembled as she moved forward, her slippers brushing the old oak floorboards. When she reached the guest room, she hesitated before knocking. There was no reply. She turned the handle, slowly pushing the door open. The bed was neatly made. The fire had burned down to embers. But Thomas was nowhere to be seen. Margaret's throat tightened. On the small desk near the window lay a leather-bound notebook. Its cover was damp with frost. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The first page contained a hand-drawn sketch of her cottage, every detail exact, from the ivy creeping up the walls to the crack in the front step. The next pages showed something stranger, maps of Dunmere from 2 centuries ago, notes written in Latin, and a single name repeated over and over in black ink. Ellison. Suddenly, a floorboard groaned behind her. She turned sharply, the candlelight flickering across the empty hall. "Mr. Reed," she whispered. A shadow moved past the end of the corridor, swift and silent. Margaret followed it, her breath shallow. The hallway seemed longer than she remembered, the walls closing in. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and something metallic. When she reached the staircase, she froze. At the bottom stood Thomas, dressed in the same dark coat, staring up at her. His expression was unreadable, yet there was a strange calm in his eyes, as if he had expected her to come. "You shouldn't wander the house at night, Mrs. Ellison," he said quietly. "Some rooms remember more than others." Her voice trembled. "You've been walking upstairs. What are you doing here?" Thomas stepped closer, the candlelight glinting off his eyes. "Looking," he murmured, "for the truth that was buried here long ago." Then, without another word, he turned and walked towards the cellar door. The heavy lock slid open with a sound that made her skin crawl. Margaret stood frozen on the landing, unable to move, as the storm howled louder outside. And somewhere beneath the house, something began to knock back. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, her hand trembling as she held the flickering candle. The cellar door gaped open, revealing nothing but darkness below. The air that rose from it was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and iron. She called out, "Thomas," but there was no answer, only the echo of her voice disappearing into the depths. Gathering her courage, she stepped down the narrow staircase, each board groaning beneath her weight. The candlelight danced along the stone walls, revealing cobwebs and old shelves lined with bottles long turned to dust. Halfway down, she saw it, Thomas standing motionless at the far end of the cellar, facing the wall. His lantern hung beside him, unlit. Margaret's voice quivered. "What are you doing down here?" Thomas turned slowly. His face was pale, his expression distant. "There's something buried beneath this floor," he said quietly. "Something your husband tried to keep hidden." Margaret frowned. "That's absurd. This is just a cellar." But Thomas knelt, brushing away the layer of dust near the far wall. The stones were uneven, and beneath one, something glinted faintly in the light. He pried it loose with a metal tool from his pocket. Beneath the stone lay an old tin box, rusted and sealed with wax. Margaret's breath caught. "What is that?" "Proof," he said, "of what really happened here." He broke the seal and opened the box. Inside were several folded letters, yellowed with age, and a locket tarnished by time. He held it out to her. Inside the locket was a miniature painting of a woman who looked unmistakably like Margaret. Margaret stumbled back, clutching the edge of the wall. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Who is she?" Thomas's eyes lifted to meet hers, cold and steady. "Her name was Margaret Ellison," he said. "She lived here 140 years ago. She died the night of the fire." The candle in her hand flickered violently, then went out, plunging the cellar into darkness. In the silence that followed, something moved in the shadows, something that was not Thomas Reed. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving Dunmere veiled in a pale silence. The snow lay deep around the cottage, soft as ash. Yet inside, the air felt heavier than ever. Margaret awoke on the sofa by the hearth, unsure how she had come to rest there. The cellar door stood closed, the key missing from its lock. Thomas was nowhere to be found. She rose, her head throbbing with the memory of the night before, the letters, the locket, and that impossible name. Her own name. 140 years ago. It made no sense. And yet, when she looked into the mirror above the mantelpiece, she thought she saw another face shimmer faintly behind hers, older, sterner, with the same eyes. Trying to shake off the chill that crept along her spine, Margaret searched for the letters Thomas had uncovered. They were gone. Only the locket remained, resting on the table as if placed there deliberately. She opened it again. The woman's painted eyes seemed to follow her, filled with an emotion Margaret could not name, sorrow, or warning. Footsteps sounded outside. Margaret turned quickly and opened the door. A young man in a postman's uniform stood there, holding a parcel. "Morning, Mrs. Ellison," he said cheerfully. "A delivery for you." "From London." "I haven't ordered anything," she replied, frowning. He shrugged. Came through special request. Been delayed by the storm. When he left, Margaret set the parcel on the table and untied the string. Inside lay a single item wrapped in cloth, a framed portrait, dark with age. Her heart stopped. It was the same woman from the locket, but painted in larger detail, her features uncanny in their resemblance to Margaret's. The name carved into the frame read, Margaret Ellison, 1884. The room grew colder. Frost crept across the edges of the glass. Then, as she stared, she noticed something impossible. The woman's hand in the painting was resting on a man's shoulder. But as the frost thickened, the faint outline of that man began to sharpen. It was Thomas Reed. The portrait began to tremble against the wall, and a whisper rose from nowhere, threading through the silence. "Welcome home, Margaret." By evening, the sky had turned a dull silver, and the snow outside glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. Margaret sat in the parlor, staring at the portrait that now hung on her wall. She had tried to move it, to hide it beneath a cloth, but somehow it always returned to the same place, above the fireplace, where her late husband's picture used to be. The house was too quiet. Even the ticking of the old clock had stopped. She tried to read, to distract herself, but the letters on the page blurred, and each time she looked up, she swore the woman in the painting had shifted her gaze. Then came the faint sound of music. It drifted from somewhere upstairs, a slow, melancholy tune played on a piano. But the piano had not been touched since her husband's death. Margaret rose slowly and followed the sound up the staircase. The air grew colder with each step. At the end of the corridor, the door to her husband's study stood ajar, and a faint golden light spilled through the crack. She pushed it open. Thomas was there. He sat at the piano, his back to her, playing softly. His hands moved with deliberate grace, though his reflection in the mirror above the piano did not move at all. When he finally stopped and turned, there was a look of quiet resignation in his eyes. "You shouldn't have found the painting," he said. "It has started now." Margaret's voice trembled. "Started what? Who are you, really?" Thomas looked down at his hands. "Not who you think. I came here to finish what I began long ago. The Ellisons made a promise, to keep the past buried. But you, Margaret, you opened the door." A sudden gust blew through the room, extinguishing the candlelight. The window panes rattled as if struck by invisible hands. In the darkness, Margaret saw flashes, of fire, of faces screaming, of the house engulfed in smoke. When the vision faded, she found herself standing alone. Thomas was gone. The portrait downstairs had fallen to the floor, its glass shattered. And there, behind the torn canvas, was another painting beneath it, a burning house, and a woman standing before it, holding a candle that looked exactly like the one trembling in Margaret's hand. Margaret did not sleep that night. The wind howled through the chimneys, and every shadow seemed to shift with a life of its own. She sat before the broken painting, staring at the image of the burning house beneath. The candle in her hand had nearly melted down to the holder, yet she dared not blow it out. She could no longer deny it, the woman in the second painting was her. The same tilt of the head, the same eyes, the same expression of terror. But how could that be? Morning came dull and cold. Frost clung to the windows like veins of glass. Margaret wrapped herself in a shawl and went to the library, determined to uncover the truth about the Ellisons. She sifted through old documents, letters, and estate records until one yellowed ledger caught her attention. Inside was a single entry, written in faded ink. November 14, 1874. The house was purged by fire. Lady Ellison perished, yet her likeness remains. The promise must never be broken. Her hands trembled. The date was the same as her own birthday. A knock startled her. It came from the front door, slow, deliberate, as if the visitor already knew she was there. She hesitated, then opened it. Outside stood a woman in a dark traveling cloak, her face half hidden by the snow. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "You have seen it, haven't you? The portrait. Once it calls, there's no turning back." Margaret stared. "Who are you?" The woman stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders. "My name is Eleanor Ashcroft. My family once lived in this house before the Ellisons. The fire that destroyed it, it wasn't an accident. The woman in your painting, she lit it herself." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "That's impossible. That would mean—" "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "You carry her face. Her memory. Perhaps even her soul. The house remembers what it lost." The clock in the hallway began to tick again, its rhythm growing faster and louder. Margaret turned toward the sound, but when she looked back, Eleanor was gone, only footprints melting on the rug remained. And in the silence that followed, the faint smell of smoke drifted through the air once more. The hours crawled by in silence. Margaret could not tell whether it was dawn or dusk. The light outside had turned a permanent shade of grey. The house felt smaller, the air heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She carried the broken painting back to the parlor, setting it before the fire. Her hands were cold, but her thoughts burned. What promise, she whispered to herself. What did they mean to keep hidden? Her question was answered by a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from beneath the floorboards. Margaret froze. The sound grew louder, deliberate, almost impatient. She grabbed a poker and knelt beside the hearth. The planks were loose. One by one, she pried them open. Underneath lay a small metal box, scorched and blackened by time. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, was a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. The first bore the name Lady Eleanor Ashcroft. Margaret unfolded the fragile paper. The ink was smeared, but the words were still legible. To whoever inherits this house, beware the fire that binds the Ashcroft and Ellison names. We swore that the truth would remain buried, for our blood runs in both families. Should you read this, the promise has been broken, and the spirit of the house will awaken to claim what was lost. Her breath caught. Blood, in both families. Could it be that she was a descendant of both the Ashcrofts and Ellisons? The candle beside her flickered violently, and from the corridor came the sound of slow footsteps, measured, heavy, and echoing against the stone floor. She turned towards the noise, her heart pounding. "Thomas," she called, her voice trembling. But when the figure appeared at the doorway, it was not Thomas. It was a woman in a tattered gown, her hair matted with ash, her eyes hollow yet burning with recognition. "Margaret," the apparition whispered. "You have come back to finish what I began." Margaret stumbled backward. "No. I am not you." The woman smiled faintly, stepping closer. "But you are. And when the fire returns, only one of us will remain." A sudden gust burst through the room, scattering the letters into the flames. They ignited at once, and the air filled with the scent of burning ink and memory. Margaret shielded her face as the portrait above the mantel began to crack, a fiery glow bleeding through the paint. And from within that glow, the figure of Thomas emerged, his expression no longer kind, but filled with the sorrow of someone who had waited centuries. The fire roared to life, swallowing the room in a furious orange glow. Margaret stumbled back as the air thickened with heat and smoke. Thomas stood within the flames, untouched, his figure half real, half memory. "Margaret," he said, his voice echoing like the crackle of burning wood. "It must end tonight. The house will not rest until the circle is complete." She shook her head, tears cutting paths through the soot on her cheeks. "What circle? Tell me what you mean." Thomas reached out a hand, his face filled with sorrow. "You are the last of them, the blood that binds Ashcroft and Ellison. The fire that consumed them was never meant to destroy. It was meant to cleanse. You must release it." The phantom woman, the reflection of Lady Alyson, stood beside him now, her gaze soft yet commanding. Set it free, child. The house remembers your pain. Let it burn, and we shall sleep once more. Margaret's heart raced. Flames licked at the furniture, the curtains, the portraits. Yet amidst the chaos, she felt an uncanny calm, as though the house was breathing through her. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the fire. If this is what it takes to end it, then let it be so. Thomas's hand hovered just inches from hers. Once you do this, there will be no return. You will become part of Dunmere's memory, just as we did. I've lived too long in its shadow, she whispered. Better to become its light. With trembling fingers, she threw the broken painting into the flames. A burst of golden light filled the room, and for a moment the world stood still. The fire grew white-hot, blinding, then silent. When the smoke finally cleared, the house of Dunmere stood quiet once again. The walls were blackened, the air still. No sign of Margaret remained, only a faint warmth lingering in the ashes, and a single ember glowing softly on the hearth. Weeks later, when a traveler passed through the village, he swore he saw a light in the window of the ruined Alyson house. A woman's silhouette, calm and kind, watching over the valley below. The villagers said Dunmere no longer felt haunted. Only watched, gently, by the woman who had given the house peace. And when winter came again, the fire never truly went out.